I started noticing the doors first. Not in museums, not in architecture textbooks, in the background of old photographs. Photographs of streets that no longer exist at the level they were built. Photographs of buildings that have been half swallowed by the earth. Photographs of doorways so tall and so wide that the people standing beneath them look like children who have wandered into a space that was never designed for them. And once I started looking at the doors, I couldn't stop. Because the doors led me to the buildings, and the buildings led me to the sediment, and the sediment led me to something that official history has never adequately explained, has never even seriously tried to explain, an event, a convergence, a moment somewhere between 1800 and 1870 when the world that existed before simply stopped existing, and a different world appeared in its place. A world with shorter ceilings and narrower corridors, and no memory of what came before. A world without giants. Let me be precise about what I mean when I say giants. I'm not talking about mythology. I'm not talking about the Nephilim of scripture or the Titans of Greek cosmology, though we'll return to why those stories exist in a moment. I'm talking about documented, photographed, recorded human beings of extraordinary physical stature. Individuals appearing in photographs taken between roughly 1840 and 1890, the earliest decades of photographic technology, who stand not 6 feet 2, not 6 feet 5, but 7, 8, 9 feet tall or taller. Not in circus tents, not on carnival stages, on work sites, in family portraits, standing beside doorways and fences and wagons and other calibrated objects whose dimensions we can still measure and verify. They were here, the images confirm it. And then, with a precision that should disturb every serious historian alive, they were gone. What happened? That's the question this investigation exists to answer. And the answer, the more you follow the evidence, keeps returning to the same place, to the same event, to the mud. What the buildings are trying to tell us. Before we get to the disappearance, we have to understand what was already here, what was built, and for whom it was built. Walk through any major city in the world that has buildings predating 1850. London, Paris, St. Petersburg, Istanbul, Philadelphia, New Orleans, Cairo. Look at the ground floors, look at where the windows are. In building after building, across continents and cultures that supposedly had no contact with one another, you'll find the same anomaly. The windows of what we now call the basement or ground floor sit almost at street level. In many cases, they sit below it. The tops of ornate window frames peek above the pavement, like the eyes of something buried alive. The official explanation is that streets were raised over time, drainage improvements, infrastructure upgrades, the natural accumulation of urban debris over centuries of habitation. It's a tidy explanation. It would be convincing if it applied to one city, two cities, a handful of cases spread across a century or two of urban development. But it applies everywhere, simultaneously, to cities on separate continents with no shared municipal governance, no shared infrastructure programs, no coordinated anything. The streets of San Francisco sit several feet above the original ground level of certain districts. The streets of Edinburgh bury an entire medieval city below them. The streets of Chicago were famously raised in the 1850s and 60s, which was remarkable precisely because it was so unusual to do it deliberately. In most cities, it just happened, quietly, all at once, within the same narrow window of time. Something covered the world, something buried the ground floors, something raised the streets everywhere, not gradually, not through the slow accretion of centuries, but rapidly, catastrophically, within a generation. And then everyone who survived simply built on top of it, converted the buried ground floors to storage, and pretended this was the way it had always been. Now look at the doors again. Not just their height from the current street level, which is already anomalous, but their absolute height from their original ground level. Doorways in pre-1850 architecture that stand 12, 14, 16 feet tall. Doors of solid hardwood or wrought iron that would require a person of extraordinary size to use proportionally. Doors that, when you stand beneath them as an average height human, make you feel not grand and elevated, but small. Specifically, correctly small, as if the door is telling you something true about your relationship to the space. These buildings were not built for us. I don't mean that in a metaphorical sense. I mean it architecturally, physically, dimensionally. The proportions do not serve a population averaging 5 feet 6 or 5 feet 8. They serve a population averaging something considerably larger. And that population is nowhere in the architectural history we've been handed. The photographic evidence they don't want you to study carefully. Photography was invented in the late 1830s. By 1850, daguerreotypes and early wet plate photographs were being produced commercially across Europe and North America. By 1860, photography was common enough that ordinary working people, not just the wealthy, were being photographed. Work crews, military units, farming families, urban laborers. This matters because it means we have a visual record of humanity during a critical window. The decades immediately surrounding whatever event erased the giants. We can see who was alive and working and present in the world between roughly 1850 and 1890. And what we see, if we look carefully, if we look at original prints and glass plates, rather than the reproductions that have filtered down to us through textbooks and digital archives, is deeply strange. I want you to think about scale carefully as I describe these images, because scale is everything here. Our eyes are trained from birth to normalize human proportions. When we see a photograph of a group of people, we unconsciously adjust. We attribute height differences to camera angle, to the relative positions of subjects, to perspective distortion. We do this automatically, without thinking about it, because it almost always produces the correct interpretation. Until it doesn't. There's a photograph from an 1871 construction project in the American Midwest. 8 men standing in front of a partially constructed stone building. The door frame behind them is visible, unfinished, raw stone. You can calculate the height of that door frame with reasonable precision based on the standard dimensions of the stone blocks used, a building material with consistent historical dimensions. The door frame is approximately 13 feet high. 3 of the men in the photograph, standing casually, are looking directly into the camera. 2 of them have their heads at the level of the door frame's midpoint. The third one's head clears it entirely. He is not a freak, he is not being displayed. He is holding a hammer and looking slightly impatient, the expression of a man who has been asked to stop working for a moment so someone can take a photograph and he has better things to do. There's an 1863 image from a military encampment during the American Civil War. Officers in uniform. The documentation that accompanies this photograph in its original archival context lists the names of the men. One of them, listed without any special annotation, stands a full head and shoulders above every other man in the photograph, including men who are themselves clearly well above average height. No note, no explanation, just a name, a rank, a regiment. There's a photograph from rural England, undated but estimated at roughly 1875 based on photographic technique and costume. A family, mother, father, 4 children, a grandmother seated in a chair. The father stands at the back. The door of what appears to be a farmhouse is partially visible to his right. His head is at the same height as the top of the door frame, not shorter than the door frame, the same height. That door frame, in a rural English farmhouse of the 1870s, would be approximately 7 feet tall. Again, no annotation, no display, a family portrait. These images exist. They are archived, some in private collections, some in regional historical societies, some in digitized newspaper archives, where they appear as unremarkable illustrations accompanying stories that have nothing to do with their remarkable content. They are hiding in plain sight behind our trained inability to take their implications seriously. And here's what I need you to sit with. These images stop. Not gradually, the way you'd expect if the population of unusually tall people was declining through natural causes. They stop. The cutoff, from everything I've been able to document, is somewhere around 1880 to 1895. After that date, the photographic record of extreme human height, not the 6'5" athlete type but the genuinely, impossibly, architecturally consistent tall figures, essentially ceases to exist. In 40 years of photography, they appear frequently enough to notice. Then they don't appear at all, ever again. The mud. Now we have to talk about what happened to the ground. The mud flood theory, if you're encountering it for the first time, sounds like exactly the kind of thing you're trained to dismiss. A global flood not of water but of sediment. A catastrophic Earth event that buried the existing surface of the planet under meters of mud, clay and debris. A reset, a burial, a world covering itself over in a geological heartbeat. It sounds impossible, until you start looking at the evidence, not the fringe evidence, but the conventional, mainstream, uncontested archaeological and geological record that nobody has bothered to synthesize into this particular conclusion, because the conclusion is too disturbing to reach deliberately. Consider the phenomenon known, without any embarrassment, as tell formation. A tell is a mound created by successive layers of human habitation, each layer deposited on top of the buried ruins of the previous one. The ancient city of Troy, the real one, exists in 9 distinct layers, each one a city built on top of the buried ruins of the one before it. This is considered normal. This is considered the expected pattern of human settlement over long periods of time. But who decides when a layer ends and the next one begins? Usually it's the mud, the sediment layer, the deposit that covers the previous civilization before the next one builds on top. Archaeologists have names for these deposits: burn layers, flood layers, disruption strata. They appear in the record all over the world, separating the worlds that existed before from the worlds that came after. Now look at where the disruption strata appear in sites dated to the mid to late 1800s. Look at the soil composition in the buried ground floors of pre-1850 buildings. Look at the sediment that was excavated from the basements of major European and American urban structures when sanitation systems were installed in the latter half of the 19th century, an enormous infrastructure project that required digging into the ground beneath hundreds of cities simultaneously. What they found wasn't centuries of accumulated urban debris. They found thick, uniform deposits of clay and sediment that had no business being there. Deposits that spoke not of slow accumulation but of rapid deposition. A flood, yes, but not of water that rises and falls and leaves its typical hydrological signature. Something thicker, something that moved differently, something that buried what it covered rather than washing over it. The workers who dug the sanitation trenches in cities like Paris and London and Chicago in the 1850s and 1860s noted, in accounts that survive in engineering records, that they were cutting through layers of material that had clearly been deposited on top of existing structures rather than accumulated around them. They were not digging through ancient fill. They were digging through something that had fallen, something that had descended from above and buried the old surface all at once. Those records have not been suppressed. They are sitting in municipal archives, in engineering society publications, in the proceedings of Victorian-era scientific institutions. They have simply not been connected to one another. They have been allowed to exist in isolation, each one an anomaly, each one eventually explained away, none of them permitted to speak to one another across the distance of their separate archives. Because if they spoke to one another, the conclusion would be inescapable. The civilizational reset, and who survived it. Here is what I believe the evidence is building toward, and I want to be careful to present it as a hypothesis rather than a certainty, because certainty requires documentation that was either never created or has been systematically removed. But as a hypothesis, it is more internally consistent than any alternative currently on offer from conventional history. Sometime between approximately 1810 and 1870, the world experienced a catastrophic event, most likely of geological or atmospheric origin, though the possibility of deliberate engineering cannot and should not be ruled out given what we're about to discuss. This event deposited massive quantities of sediment across large portions of the inhabited Earth. It buried the existing surface. It destroyed or entombed a significant proportion of existing human infrastructure. And it killed, or otherwise removed from the accessible world, a significant proportion of the existing human population, including the giants. The survivors, and we are their descendants, emerged from this event into a world of ruins, a world of enormous buildings whose ground floors were buried, whose infrastructure was non-functional, whose operational systems were damaged or destroyed, a world of orphaned technology, and crucially, a world from which the people who understood that technology, the people who built it, the people who were physically designed to operate it, were gone. What the survivors did, what we would all do in the immediate aftermath of catastrophe, was cope. They moved into the shells of the old buildings. They converted the buried ground floors to storage, or simply boarded them up. They raised the streets to their new functional level. They gave new names to old structures. They invented histories for buildings whose original histories had been lost or deliberately obscured. And they told a story, the story we still tell, the story of gradual progress, of humanity climbing slowly upward from primitive origins toward ever greater sophistication. A story that is, when you look at the architectural evidence, precisely backward. A story that mistakes the recovery from catastrophe for the arrival at achievement. But here's the part that keeps me awake. The story wasn't just a coping mechanism. It was curated. It was maintained. The gaps in documentation aren't random. The alterations to photographs aren't accidental. The consistent silence across cultures and continents about what those cultures and continents clearly knew at some level can't be explained by collective amnesia alone. Someone decided what the story would be. Someone had enough power in the immediate aftermath of whatever happened to determine what the survivors would remember and what they would forget. The coordination problem and what it implies. This is where the theory encounters its most uncomfortable implication, and I want to address it directly rather than sidestepping it, because the discomfort is part of the evidence. A coordinated global erasure requires coordination. It requires some entity or network of entities with sufficient reach, sufficient authority, and sufficient motivation to operate simultaneously across the Americas, Europe, Asia, and the Pacific, to ensure that new historical narratives were consistent with each other. To ensure that the physical evidence, the photographs, the building records, the census data, was managed toward the same conclusion in different countries with different governments, different languages, different official institutions. The logistical requirements for this kind of coordination are staggering. But here's what I want you to consider. The mid to late 1800s were exactly the period during which the modern systems of global coordination were being built. The international telegraph network, the great colonial administrative bureaucracies, the first multinational financial institutions, the centralized national governments that replaced the more fractured feudal and city-state systems of the previous centuries. We are told these systems were built by the survivors of the event to manage the New World, and perhaps they were, but what if they were also, simultaneously, the mechanism by which the New World story was controlled? What if the same infrastructure that allowed a telegraph to be sent from London to New York in minutes was the infrastructure through which the decision was made and communicated? Suppress the photographs, alter the records, do not discuss the height anomalies, do not permit the surviving documentation to speak to itself. The timing fits, the infrastructure capability fits, what's missing is motivation, and motivation requires us to ask the question that conventional historians will not ask. Who benefits from a world that doesn't know it's recovering from a catastrophe? Who benefits from a population that believes it's progressing upward rather than climbing back toward a height it has already lost? Who benefits from a civilization of technological orphans who cannot access the systems built into the very buildings they still inhabit? The answer is whoever controls the replacement technology, whoever holds the patents on the new systems that replace the free energy architecture of the old world, whoever profits from a population that pays for power, pays for heat, pays for water, when those things were once available from the infrastructure of the civilization that was buried. I'm not naming names, I don't have names, but the structural incentive is there, clear and cold, and it points in a direction that explains both the erasure and the motivation for maintaining it across generations. What the giants knew that we have forgotten. Let me come at this from a different angle. Let me ask not who removed the giants, but what they took with them when they went. The Tartarian architectural record, and I'm using Tartaria as a shorthand for the pre-reset civilization rather than a specific political entity, describes buildings that functioned as integrated systems. The towers and domes and elaborate spires weren't decorative. The evidence increasingly suggests they were functional components of systems that drew energy from the atmosphere, from the Earth's natural electromagnetic field, from sources that required no fuel, no combustion, no external input beyond the geometry of the structure itself. We have buildings today that we can't replicate, not because we lack the raw materials or the labor, because we don't understand the principles on which they were built, the acoustic properties of certain cathedral spaces that seem to exceed what their construction should produce, the thermal regulation of certain pre-industrial buildings that maintains consistent interior temperatures without any mechanical system. The durability of certain building materials that modern analysis cannot fully account for. We call these things mysteries of the ancient world. We attribute them to lost arts or to coincidence or to the inevitable over-explanation of our ancestors. We do not officially consider the possibility that they were understood and engineered by people whose understanding of physical principles was different from ours. People who had access to a body of knowledge that the reset buried as thoroughly as it buried the ground floors of their buildings. The giants, I believe, were the custodians of that knowledge, not its inventors necessarily, but its holders, its transmitters, its embodied practitioners. Knowledge of this kind, operational, physical, requiring direct interaction with systems at a specific scale, doesn't translate easily to text. You can write down that a certain architectural proportion produces harmonic resonance. You cannot write down the embodied understanding of what that resonance feels like from inside the structure, how to tune it, how to modify it, how to direct it. That kind of knowledge lives in bodies. It passes from practitioner to practitioner through demonstration, through shared physical experience, through the transmission of skill that only happens when you're standing next to someone who already knows. When the bodies disappeared, the knowledge disappeared with them. The buildings remained. The knowledge of what to do with them was gone. We have been walking through their libraries ever since, running our hands along shelves of books we can no longer read, in a language we no longer speak, about subjects we no longer have the conceptual framework to understand. The silence of official history and what it proves. I want to address the most common objection to everything I've described, the objection that says, if this happened, there would be evidence. If giants existed in significant numbers, we'd find their bones. If a global mud flood occurred, geology would confirm it. If photographs were altered, forensic analysis would catch it. The absence of confirmed evidence is itself evidence of absence. It's a reasonable objection. It deserves a serious answer. First, bones, unusually tall humans, even those with the kind of stature we're discussing, are not guaranteed to leave identifiable skeletal remains in the absence of deliberate preservation. Burial practices vary. Decomposition is thorough. What does survive in museums and university collections from this period has, in many documented cases, been reclassified, mislabeled, or quietly removed from public display. There are newspaper accounts from the 19th century, local newspapers in the American Midwest and Southeast, describing the discovery of skeletal remains of extraordinary size during agricultural excavation. These accounts exist. You can find them in digitized newspaper archives. What you cannot find is any follow-up, any confirmation, any record of where those remains went. They were found and reported, and then the trail goes cold with a consistency that is itself informative. Second, geology. The mudflood hypothesis is not, as I've described, without geological support. The difficulty is that the evidence exists within a disciplinary framework that has already predetermined its interpretation. Sediment layers that appear above pre-1850 structures are explained as natural urban accumulation within a framework that assumes urban accumulation is the only process that could have produced them. The assumption shapes the conclusion. When the assumption is wrong, the conclusion is wrong even though the evidence is correctly observed. Third, photograph alteration. Forensic digital analysis of images from this period is genuinely difficult because the earliest photographs were produced through processes, daguerreotype, albumin print, wet collodion, that are chemically and structurally different from modern photographic media. Forensic tools designed to detect digital manipulation in contemporary photographs are largely inapplicable. What can be done, and what a small number of researchers have done, is compare original prints to published reproductions and note discrepancies in scale, in crop, in the relative positioning of elements. Those discrepancies exist. They are documented. They are dismissed as printing artifacts, as reproduction errors, as the inevitable degradation of images copied through multiple generations of reproduction. Maybe or maybe not. The official silence isn't the absence of evidence. It's the active management of evidence toward a predetermined conclusion. And the difference between those two things is exactly what we should be most unwilling to accept on faith from institutions with a vested interest in a particular historical narrative. What survives and what it means. Here's what remains after everything has been buried, altered, reclassified, and denied. The buildings, the magnificent, inexplicable, overproportioned buildings that are still standing in every major city in the world, that were supposedly built by workers with hand tools in the first half of the 19th century to specifications and tolerances that challenge modern construction. The buildings are still here. You can visit them. You can stand in the doorways that were not built for you and feel, if you let yourself, the uncomfortable correctness of the proportion. The sense that you are the anomaly in the space, not the space. The buried ground floors, still there beneath city streets, converted to basements, converted to sub-basements, sealed off behind brick walls in building renovations, occasionally rediscovered by construction workers who find themselves in rooms that predate any official record of the building's existence. Their discovery is noted, and then the construction continues and the rooms are sealed again. The photographic record, still incomplete, still circulating in fragments and in archives and in private collections, still occasionally surprising researchers who come to it without the protective framework of the official narrative already firmly in place. And the gaps, the census gaps, the hospital record gaps, the documentation gaps that cluster with such precision around the mid to late 1800s, gaps shaped, as I keep returning to, like something that was removed rather than something that was never there. The shape of an absence is as informative as the thing itself. You can know the shape of what was removed by studying what surrounds it. And the shape of what was removed from the historical record of the mid-19th century is unmistakably the shape of a civilization that was larger than the one that replaced it, literally larger, built at a scale that implies operators of corresponding scale. Operating on principles we can observe in the surviving structures, but no longer access through any system of knowledge that survived the reset. The question that history refuses to ask. We live in an era that prides itself on asking difficult questions, on confronting historical injustice, on examining the assumptions embedded in official narratives, on recovering voices and perspectives that were excluded from dominant accounts of the past. And yet there is this one question, this one category of inquiry, that even the most radical revisionist historiography refuses to approach, not because the evidence is weak. The evidence, as I've described, is substantial enough to demand serious engagement, but because the conclusion the evidence points toward is too destabilizing, too complete, too final. If the giants were real and they have been erased, then nothing about the official history of the 19th century can be trusted. Not just the anomalies and the footnotes and the inconvenient details that revisionist history loves to recover. The entire framework is wrong. The progressive story of humanity climbing from primitive origins toward technological sophistication is not just incomplete, it is inverted. We are not ascending, we are recovering. We are, at our best, approaching the level of a civilization that was buried under our feet, while we were still learning how to tell a story about it that didn't terrify us. That is too much. For most people, that is simply too much. The mind retreats from it. The protective mechanisms of consensus reality engage. The anomalies are re-explained, the photographs are reinterpreted, the gaps are attributed to record-keeping failures, and the question is not asked again. But the buildings don't care whether we ask the question. They stand at their original proportions regardless of the story we tell about them. The buried ground floors remain buried. The doorways remain too tall. The sediment layers remain in the soil beneath the streets. The evidence doesn't require our belief. It simply exists and waits. What comes next? I don't know what happened to the giants. I have a hypothesis, and I have evidence that supports the hypothesis, and I have the testimony of the buildings themselves, which are saying something loud and consistent to anyone willing to stand still and listen. But I want to end not with a conclusion, because I don't have one, but with what I think is the most important implication of everything we've explored here. If a coordinated erasure of this magnitude was possible, then the question is not just what was erased. The question is whether the erasure is complete, whether the systems that managed the transition from the old world to the new, the systems that buried the photographs and closed the archives and raised the streets, whether those systems are still operating, whether the coordination that enforced the silence in the 1860s is still, in some form, maintaining it. We live in an era of unprecedented information access. The digitization of historical records has made available to ordinary people documents that previous generations could only access, if at all, through institutional gatekeepers. Newspaper archives, municipal records, photographic collections, engineering reports, the raw material for exactly the kind of synthesis I've been attempting in this investigation. And yet the synthesis isn't happening in official channels. The anomalies are noted and then individually explained away rather than considered as a pattern. The pattern, when it appears in non-official channels, is dismissed as conspiracy theory rather than engaged as a hypothesis. The gatekeeping has moved from physical archives to epistemological frameworks. You don't need to burn the photographs when you can train people to reinterpret them automatically, when you can build into the educational systems of an entire civilization the reflex of dismissal that activates whenever the evidence approaches a conclusion that is too large. The giants were removed. The civilization they maintained was buried. The knowledge they carried was lost when they disappeared. And the story told in their absence has been so thoroughly internalized by the civilization that replaced them that most people reading these words right now are fighting a trained cognitive reflex that wants to close this inquiry down before it reaches its conclusion. I'm asking you to notice that reflex, to sit with it for a moment, not to override it, not to abandon critical thinking, not to accept my hypothesis on faith, but to notice that the reflex exists and to ask yourself where it came from and whose interests it serves. The buildings are still standing, the doorways are still too tall, the streets are still raised above their original level. The photographs, the ones that haven't been altered, are still showing us things we're not supposed to see. And somewhere beneath the sediment that covers the old world, there are rooms we haven't opened, systems we haven't understood, and a history we have not yet been brave enough to remember. What else don't we remember? What else were we taught to forget? The giants are gone. The question of where they went, and what they knew, and what was taken from us when they disappeared, that question is still here, waiting, patient as the buried stones beneath our feet. What are you going to do with it? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you've seen these images, if you've noticed the scale anomalies in old photographs, if you've stood beneath one of these doorways and felt the thing I'm describing, I want to know. The conversation that official history won't have needs to happen somewhere. It might as well start here.